In late December of 1487, two caravels were making their way through the vast uncharted waters along the coast of Africa. No European had ever been this way. They were pushing the final frontier back, but were truly sailing into the unknown. Suddenly, a powerful storm hit the ships, pushing them from the relative safety of coastal waters and far out into the open ocean. It was at this point when the storms began to abate that the commander of the ships, a nobleman by the name of Bartolomeu Dias, made a very fateful decision. Instead of immediately heading due east to reclaim the sight of land, he instead allowed the westerly winds and the ocean currents to guide his vessels. Nature moved the ships further to the west and then to the south. Eventually, their course would turn them northeast. For 30 extremely tense days, as supplies and morale dwindled, there was no sight of land whatsoever. Had this been a massive mistake? Had Bartolomeu Dias condemned his men to a slow death on the ocean? Then, suddenly on February 3, 1488, emerging from the distant horizon, land was finally spotted. The two ships quickly made their way to disembark, but once they made landfall, the real question remained. Where exactly had they arrived at? Was this just another bay on the seemingly endless coastline of Africa? Was the Ptolemaic principle, which stated that the Indian Ocean was a closed-off, inaccessible body of water, correct? Or had this Portuguese explorer just discovered the tip of Africa, and in so doing had uncovered the fabled passage to India with all the wealth that it held? In the early part of the 1400s, Portugal had taken a commanding lead on exploration. Prince Henry, known as Henry the Navigator, had been a massive proponent and patron of exploration and technological development. He had set the standard that his countrymen would adopt and eagerly follow. By the time of his death in 1460, Portuguese ships had discovered and colonized the Madeira Islands, the Azores, and the Cape Verde archipelago. The western coast of Africa had been explored to the sub-Saharan regions, but Portugal was only getting warmed up. In 1471, Fernão Gomes arrived in what is now modern-day Ghana to discover a flourishing gold trade, which gave rise to the name, the Gold Coast. By 1482, the mouth of the mighty Congo River had been discovered by Diogo Cao. This Portuguese explorer would continue south, and by 1486 he had reached Cape Cross in present-day Namibia. As the Portuguese made their way down the coast of Africa, forts and trading posts were established, harbors and ports were constructed, and padraos, which were stone pillars crowned with a cross that served as markers, were erected nearly to the Tropic of Capricorn. However, despite these successes, for the King of Portugal, this was simply not enough. The great-grandson of John I, who had founded the House of Aviz, the ruling dynasty of Portugal at that time, was a man named John II. When his father died in 1481, he became King of Portugal and proved to be a very capable ruler. John II was a Renaissance man. Alongside his father, he had conquered lands in North Africa, taken the city of Tangier, and had distinguished himself at the Battle of Toro against Castile in 1474. But aside from simply leading men into combat, John had a very talented mind for exploration and commerce. This Portuguese king was renowned for having two major obsessions. First, he wanted to find a way to get to India, and second, he wanted to reach the legendary Prester John. India made complete economic sense. It was the source of the spice trade after all, and therefore it would be the source of immense wealth. Prester John was the epitome of the crusading desire to vanquish Islam. This fabled Christian king was said to have an incredible treasury and vast armies under his command. Now, theoretically speaking, if only the Christians of the West could reach him, then he could unleash his forces, and perhaps the caliphate could be crushed. By the 15th century, it was determined that Prester John was no longer in Asia, but now someplace in Africa. Roger Crowley in the book Conquerors explains just how devoted King John was to accomplishing these goals. Quote, "The king had gathered around him a loyal generation of highly talented pilots, sailors, and adventurers, chosen for their talents rather than their social status. In 1486, he energetically planned a three-pronged approach to solving the India problem and locating Prester John. First and foremost, a focused expedition would attempt to sail around Africa. Second, along the way, it would drop off Portuguese-speaking native Africans to seek information about the legendary Christian king in the interior of the continent. And third, an overland expedition to the east would be conducted using Arabic speakers who could penetrate the heartlands of the Indies to learn about spices, Christian kings, and the possibility of sailing routes to the Indian Ocean. John appointed a knight of his household by the name of Bartolomeu Dias to command the next expedition down the African coast. For the overland expedition, the king recruited Pero de Covija. Covija was about 40 years old, a quick-witted, multi-talented adventurer of lowly birth. He was also an adept swordsman, a loyal servant of the Portuguese king, and a spy. It was Covija and another Arabic speaker, Afonso de Paiva, to whom the king now entrusted this daring overland operation." End quote. In the spring of 1487, Covija and Paiva set out from Barcelona and sailed across the Mediterranean to arrive in Rhodes. In the city of Rhodes, they purchased an entire ship's hold worth of honey so they could pass as merchants. They then promptly made their way south, arriving at the port of Alexandria in Egypt. The two blended in and immediately got to work gathering intelligence, spying on the incoming merchants to discover any hint of the trade routes to the east. But shortly after they arrived, both of the king's men were bedridden with fever. Meanwhile, far to the west, Bartolomeu Dias was preparing a journey of his own. At the time, he wouldn't know it, but this voyage he was about to undertake would have a dramatic effect on world history. Bartolomeu Dias was born about 1450 into the aristocracy. He had the favor of King John II and was a member of his court. He came from a line of sailors and had gained a considerable amount of experience on other expeditions along the African coast. In 1482, he joined an expedition to present-day Ghana to establish the fortress of Elmina on the Gold Coast, which, by the way, gave Portugal a very firm hand on the gold trade. It has been suggested that Diaz was also a part of Cow's discovery of the Congo River. Sadly, very little is known of Diaz's exploits in early life, as the Portuguese kept his records a state secret, likely to keep that information from falling into the hands of rivals, and later an earthquake in 1755 destroyed those archives. In July or August of 1487, Diaz was given 3 ships by the crown. 2 were caravels, the São Pantaleo, and his flagship, which he personally commanded, the São Cristavo. The third was a square-rigged support ship which Diaz placed his brother Pero in charge of. On board the ships, Diaz had brought several padraos that he would embed as markers and 6 African slaves, 4 women and 2 men. The Africans had been taught Portuguese, had been adorned in fine clothing, and were given offerings of silver and gold. They would be dropped off at various spots in Africa to serve as ambassadors, to proclaim the glory of the Portuguese and to inquire about Prester John. Their fate, however, is lost to history, and it would seem that little was gained by this endeavor. Diaz set out from Lisbon. He stopped in Ghana at the Elmina fortress to take on more supplies and then continued further south. Eventually, he passed the last padrao, placed at Cape Cross by Diogo Cao the year before. On December 8, 1487, he arrived at Walvis Bay in present-day Namibia, where the supply ship and 9 men were parked. Most of the supplies were transferred to the caravels, and the voyage would continue on. It was near New Year's Day that the 2 caravels sailed into a storm, which pushed them from the coast into open waters, at which time a monumental choice was made. Roger Crowley explains, quote, "The pilots took a startling decision. at about 29 degrees south, they gave up the attritional battle with the adverse winds and currents. Instead, they turned their ships away from the shore, lowered their sails to half-mast, and flung themselves out into the void of the westerly ocean, with the counterintuitive aim of sailing east eventually. No one knows exactly why this happened. It may have been a maneuver worked out in advance, or it may have been a moment of genius, an intuition, a gut feeling about the Atlantic winds based on previous experiences. Whatever the logic, this was a decisive moment in the history of the world." End quote. For 30 days, Bartolomeu Dias and his men were alone on an endless ocean. The winds and the currents carried them to the west and then to the south. The weather became colder and colder as they traversed into the southernmost latitudes. Eventually, the currents and the wind began to push them to the northeast. On February 3, 1488, after being a month at sea, the exhausted and frightened crews saw land once again. They came ashore at a place that would be called the Bay of the Cowherds, later to be known as Mosul Bay. The question on everybody's mind was, well, where were they? No European had ever ventured this far. There simply was no other points of reference. Undaunted, Diaz ordered his men to sail due east. They traversed for another 200 miles along the coast. Then, irrefutably, the coast began to turn to the northeast and the weather began to get warmer. Diaz knew then and there that he had made it around Africa. On March 12, 1488, Diaz anchored at a bay near a rocky headland named Quaihok, where he placed his furthest padrao. His supplies were now critical, and his men's morale was ready to break into open mutiny. However, he and his men agreed to travel for 3 more days. They arrived at a river they would call the Rio Infante. For Bartolomeu Diaz, this was as far as his voyage would take him. As he sailed back, he saw his last padrao. The historian João de Barros would later say of him, quote, "When he departed from the pillar, he was overcome by great sadness and deep emotion, as if he was saying goodbye to a son banished forever. He had remembered the great danger faced by him and all his men, how long they had journeyed to come only to this point, then that God had not granted him the main prize. He saw the land of India, but could not enter it, like Moses in the promised land." End quote. Meanwhile, on the very other end of Africa, Paiva and Covija had recovered from their illnesses and had continued on their mission for the king. They traveled down the Nile to Cairo, and there they took a caravan across the desert to the Red Sea. They boarded ship and traveled to the city of Aden in Yemen at the end of the Arabian Peninsula. At Aden, the 2 men decided to part ways. Paiva would travel to Ethiopia to track down Prester John. Covija, on the other hand, found his way across the Arabian desert. He then boarded ship once again, and after a week on the ocean, he arrived in India at the city of Calicut in autumn of 1487. He had accomplished his mission for the King of Portugal. Calicut was a major hub of the spice trade. Covija would continue his trek, recording everything as he went, from the water currents to the prevailing winds to the cities and the people that he encountered. He moved along the western seaboard of India, and by spring of 1488, he was in Goa. Eventually, he embarked on another ship, crossed the Persian Gulf, and arrived at Ormuz, which happened to be another hub of the spice trade. It wasn't until 1491, 4 years after Covija had left Portugal, that he arrived back in Cairo. Surprisingly, 2 Portuguese messengers that had been dispatched by the king managed to find him. They would take his valuable report back to King John II. However, Covija's travels had made him a man that was no longer capable of going home. He soon discovered that his companion Paiva had died while seeking Prester John. Roger Crowley describes Covija's amazing journey and journey's end. Quote, "Covija seems to have been bitten by incurable wanderlust. He decided to finish off Paiva's business. Heavily disguised, he took a tour of the holy places of Islam, Mecca and Medina, before striking out for the Ethiopian highlands. Here, he became the first Portuguese to meet the man they would know as Prester John, the Christian Emperor of Ethiopia. The current ruler, Iskender, received him honorably but refused to let him leave. He was discovered in the country 30 years later by a Portuguese expedition to whom he would tell his story. He remained in Ethiopia until the day he died." End quote. Meanwhile, going back to 1488, Bartolomeu Dias was making his return journey. On his passage west, he became the first European to see the Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms, named after its incredibly unpredictable weather. He then rounded the tip of Africa again, making his way north. He arrived at his supply ship in Namibia in July of 1488. Of the 9 men he had stationed there, only 3 remained. The supply ship itself was unsalvageable. The undaunted explorer continued north, passing by bays and capes that were now well known to the Portuguese. He arrived back in Lisbon in December of 1488. Altogether, he had traveled for over a year and a half. His voyage was estimated to be approximately 16,000 miles, which, by the way, the circumference of the Earth is just shy of 25,000. When he arrived back, he was celebrated as being the first European to round the tip of Africa and firmly disprove the Ptolemaic doctrine. But King John II did not seem happy with him. It's unknown exactly what was said, but perhaps there was some resentment that he didn't make it to India. Either way, Bartolomeu Dias seemed to have fallen out of favor with the sovereign at this point. He would never be the leader of an expedition again. But that's not to say that the story of Diaz ends here. In retrospect, the king did make it a point to rename Diaz's Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms, and instead named it the Cape of Good Hope. This may have seemed like a simple PR move, but perhaps for the king it was a challenge to his countrymen to see who could push the limit further. To the credit of the Portuguese sense of exploration, that challenge would soon be accepted. Based on the work of Diaz, Paiva, and Covija, a new round of explorers would seek out that sea passage to India, which in the end was simply too tempting and ambitious a goal to pass up. Folks, I want to give a big shout out to the Explorers podcast by Matt Green. As I've mentioned before, there's not that much known about Bartolomeu Dias. This podcast is extremely well done and was helpful in my research. Matt was extremely kind to send me his material. If you get a chance, check out the Explorers podcast. I will post the link in the description of the video.